I was born to rock the world.
Duke Nukem Forever isn't a game we think about very often, at least not in my circles, but we used to. We used to think about it a lot. The game's 15-year development cycle kept it on vaporware listicles for a very long time. Its initials ring true to its reputation that it did not finish. And for a time, it didn't. Developer 3D Realms ran out of money in 2009 and production shut down entirely. It wasn't until Gearbox pulled out their drawer of duct tape and purchased the game and the Duke Nukem IP entirely that it finally made it to store shelves in 2011. And for all that wait, it wasn't good. It was actually very bad. But Duke Nukem Forever didn't need to end up in such a lurch, forgotten and unremarkable beyond the memory of its undisciplined development cycle. 3D Realms as a producer and a label proved that they could ship games during that time. Before Duke Nukem Forever became the vaporware king, 3D Realms had another game that frequently topped those lists, Prey. And while it still took 11 years to get the game out the door, Prey shipped, and people seemed to like it. It wasn't a masterpiece by any means, falling into that awkward era of early Xbox 360 shooters, but it was a late summer science fiction shooter, surprise, with a lot of technical achievements that had been first detailed a decade earlier in the pages of gaming magazines. It had portals before Portal, it played with gravity in very interesting ways, and it's probably the best demonstration of id Tech 4. Yes, even better than Doom 3, the game they built the engine for. Prey even featured an indigenous protagonist connecting with the religion of his ancestors in a story based on actual Cherokee folklore. It released at a time when nearly all action game protagonists were clone-stamped, square-jawed white dudes or, Lara Croft, so the diversity was definitely a surprise. These days, Prey seems to be best remembered for its cancelled parkour-friendly Alien Metropolis sequel by the same developer, or Arcane's entirely unrelated immersive sim. For those who really did enjoy it, Prey was a gem that the spotlight quickly pivoted away from. Where did Prey go? And when it was here, what did it accomplish? Let's find out. It may not be the first, but it is the Nth Review, number 17, for Prey, brought to you by my patrons at patreon.com/The Nth Review.
Uniqua, whose breath gives life to all worlds, help us in our time of need, deliver us from evil.
I didn't come here to replace you. I came here to destroy you!
Such anger, such hostility, such potential.
My place is here, by your side. You will have need of me this night.
Now it's over.
No, Elsie. It has just begun.
It feels weird to say that I remember 1995 pretty well, a year that came before a lot of you guys were even born. In my life, it was a time before YouTube, broadband internet, or even dial-up internet. Gaming magazines on store shelves were just starting to ship with CD-ROMs loaded with demos and trailers. Right as 3D games were starting to heat up, the best way to understand how they were changing year to year, or month to month, was either in printed screenshots or articulated by text. I remember Prey in those days, but despite PC Gamer's efforts, it was hard for my preteen brain to comprehend what the game was bringing to the table until years later, because its technological innovations were so hard to describe. Multicolored lighting? Yeah, sure, I get that was becoming a thing in the late 90s. Destructible environments long before Red Faction or Minecraft? Sure. But portals, in which entire other spaces could be stapled onto another surface, allowing you to transition between different locations seamlessly? That was much harder to convey. For 3D Realms, it was even harder to understand because they were the ones who had to make it work. And they couldn't. The original Prey was supposed to be the first of a series of games inspired by indigenous mythology, featuring an indigenous hero. And I have to make a point here. that these are not Indians, which is the term confused European colonists used to label the people who had been living here for thousands of years. So you won't hear me using the term unironically. In fact, to my recollection, it only pops up in the final game as a pejorative right before you crack the heads of some racist shithead bikers.
Hey, you sell any of that red engine shit? My wife loves that turquoise crap.
Oh, this is a bar. We don't sell jewelry.
Yeah, maybe she's got something else for sale.
Nothing either of you could afford.
Hell, even calling the indigenous inhabitants Native American seems really weird, considering they didn't call this America either. But this is something I'm learning and growing about. Anyway, Prey was originally a Talon Brave game, and 3D Realms had a lot of faith in the game and its future sequels. Tom Hall had even spent a year developing the story before leaving to co-found Ion Storm with John Romero, a time in which he added the alien abduction element to the story, because Tom Hall. After that, Paul Shutima took over production. He's the mulleted whiz kid we see in the game's only behind-the-scenes video footage from that era at E3 1998. They wrote a novella for the game's story, setting it on an alien Dyson sphere. For perspective, this wasn't long after the premiere of Relics, the Star Trek Next Generation Scotty episode that featured one of these massive star energy harvesting spheres in which its entire massive internal surface is habitable. But in Prey it would have a bunch of vicious aliens that you'd have to blast through. Of course, at another point, Prey took place on a Halo-ish ring. All of Prey's technology was new and fresh and built in-house, back in a time when seemingly every studio moving into 3D gaming was creating their own engine to solve the new unique problems that their new games were creating. Despite their best efforts, Prey's portals were more for show than anything practical. On top of that, a switch from 3DFX's Glide API to early DirectX for all the 3D processing required a ton of engine rebuilding that 3D Realms didn't have a lot of appetite for. They were also making another game at that time that needed more hands-on deck, and so staffers got pulled. Prey was never cancelled, but it was shelved, and compounded by the lag of gaming magazines, its fate fell far more precarious than it would now in the instantaneous gaming news cycle. This was the end of the 90s version of Prey. 3D Realms decided that 2001 was the best time to reboot Prey, so Gathering of Developers head Mike Wilson suggested to 3D Realms co-founder and producer Scott Miller that they bring in developer Human Head. The Madison, Wisconsin studio was largely formed by veteran developers from nearby Raven, and best known at that time for Rune on the PlayStation 2. To their credit, much of the work that had gone into the 90s version of Prey was brought out from the warehouse with some tweaks. Talon Brave was now Damasi Tuwodi with the anglicized name Tommy. The Dyson Sphere was still a sphere, but a much smaller one that came to Earth to harvest people for their protein. At least one version of this new game screenplay was written by Gary Whitta. Gary Whitta is a dude that I have known for a while. From 1996 to 2000, he ran PC Gamer's US edition, the same magazine that tried to describe Prey in its previews. The late 90s weren't just my formative years as a gamer, but the period where I began to understand how magazines and the media worked. When Gary Whitta left PC Gamer, he would go on to become a screenwriter and eventual novelist, but his work definitely seems like a left turn from his clever and colorful commentary in my favorite monthly gaming magazine. Take his first movie, The Book of Eli, which was a dour, bleak tale about a blind man who travels across the wasteland. Or After Earth, which was a dour, bleak tale about a father and son who crash land. Or Rogue One, which was a dour, bleak tale about a suicide mission. Or his novel Abomination, which was a dour, bleak tale about a fanatical English priest. I mean, you get my point. Prey's story becomes a dour, bleak tale about a Cherokee man who watches his fellow abductees get ground into moist stains to service a massive organic spaceship. It's not the cheeriest stuff, but we can talk about that a lot more later. While Human Head still wound up developing a ton of their own technology to make their version of Prey, by the early aughts, they were also able to license a bunch of it too. Human Head and 3D Realms worked on the game in secret for years until their big reveal at E3 2005. And I was there. I remember stepping into that tiny theater box in the South Hall and watching a series of very impressive technical vignettes and being absolutely blown away. I'd never seen anything like it. Like a strange miracle, Prey shipped in August 2006, and I played the demo at least a dozen times, back when games shipped with demos. I guess I just wasn't interested in a 6 to 8 hour $60 shooter when the reception wasn't mind-blowing, and I wasn't going to be playing it online. It would be another 6 years before I bought the game and played it to completion, and at the time, I didn't really care for it, which justified the wait in my mind. With the leak of the 2001 trade show demo of a very unfinished Duke Nukem Forever, 3D Realms co-founder Scott Miller emerged with a brief blog post largely confirming its authenticity. He also acknowledged what we've all pretty much known forever, that development on Duke Nukem Forever killed 3D Realms, and games like Max Payne and Prey kept the lights on, while Duke Nukem's director and Scott Miller's business partner George Broussard refused to ship a game. Looking back, it feels kinda strange that Prey shipped and Duke Nukem Forever didn't. Both games were developed by small teams that worked lean and cheaply by simply taking their time. This lean and mean style of development was apparently Ken Levine's dream in scaling Irrational down from hundreds of employees to a few dozen after BioShock Infinite. But this was also pretty common in the late 90s and early aughts. The difference between the two 3D Realms games came because they intentionally limited the scope of Prey, and Miller was interested in shipping titles and understood the business of development. But with Duke Nukem, they intentionally went maximalist, not just to show that they had the chops, not just because George Broussard wanted every shiny new trinket in his game he could possibly afford, not just because their lean and mean development style ran cheap, but after a point, it became a way to justify the game's lengthy development. Miller and Broussard have gone knives out about the death of 3D Realms and Duke Nukem Forever since the demo leak, but I think it's pretty clear who was in the wrong here. Despite my issues with it, Prey wound up on store shelves and Metacritic in far better shape than its much higher profile sibling, and wound up with its own batch of glittering technical achievements. Speaking of which, Prey has a very distinctive look and sound, something that stuck with me over the years. This is due in large part to the game being built on id Tech 4, one of the first and few games to do so. I remember being in high school watching this tiny, low-resolution video of John Carmack demonstrating the id Tech 4 engine at Macworld, alongside Steve Jobs, and being blown away at this early version of Doom 3. It was one of the first implementations of per-pixel lighting in a game, and it was possible thanks to NVIDIA's GeForce 3, which also powered the graphics in the original Xbox and made that port of Doom 3 possible. But as memorable as Doom 3's look and feel was, Prey really elevated the possibilities of id Tech 4. It has a lot more color and personality, and the set pieces are much grander. There are plenty of holdovers, like the thousands of square miles of metal grates, or the ever-present guardrails, but Prey also took advantage of cool disintegrating texture tricks. I remember a graphical hallmark of any new pretty game was how awesome its hallways and corridors looked. In Doom 3, they looked amazing, but in Prey, they looked nuts. Then I realized this was a bit misleading because these enclosed small spaces were most of what these games offered because John Carmack's new sophisticated lighting was nearly impossible otherwise. This was something the big open spaces of Unreal or voxel-based stuff like the Nova Logic games could happily dance around, even if their lighting wasn't as good. Playing Doom 3 again for the first time in almost 20 years, it was hard to get over how cramped and linear the levels were, even its outdoor sections. They're tightly folded upon themselves like origami. Doom 3 was also very, very dark to demonstrate the innovative lighting, and Prey has to suffer from this as well. One of my favorite artifacts of this era, however, are the engine's stencil shadows, something I explore a bit more with my Doom 3 footage here than I did in Prey, but they're in there just the same. Even Monolith Sphere featured these. The mid-aughts were wild. These ultra hard-edged shadows were a momentary blip in graphical technology that wouldn't survive into the development of shadow mapping, where shadows got diffusion and became common in basically all modern video games. Just stop and look at these shadows. They're so unnatural, so strange, being traced like vectors off the model that's casting them. I'm glad this BFG edition of Doom 3 preserved them because they are truly a sight to behold, and honestly, they fit well with the surrealistic environments that you're shooting through anyway. I honestly didn't care for any of Prey's creature designs, whether it was the shooty dudes, or the not caco demons, or the balloon dogs. None of them worked for me at all. That said, a few extra years gives Prey some more intricate models, something that Doom 3 was famously able to fake out through its extensive early use of normal mapping. Prey also carries the consistent glazed ceramic look of its predecessors, especially so with the organic squishy bits that you encounter throughout the game. It also has mirrors, which is so rad. We'll talk more about the level design in that later. What isn't so rad is this nasty-ass UI, another aesthetic product of that era. You don't have to love the flat design vibe of the next Prey, but it's hard to deny that the trapezoidal, liquid, aqua-flavored buttons and other clunky-ass chrome around everything is terrifyingly ugly. The sound design is equally distinctive and memorable. There are lots of squishy sounds and Foley work everywhere you go in this game, and the alien guns have some of my favorite sound effects in any game. The slip click as your basic gun recharges always pops to mind when I remember this game, as does the discharge of the sniper rifle. The score is classical and bombastic, provided by brothers Jeremy and Jolie and Soleil, but that's only when I could hear it. It often disappears into the background mix. Jeremy's scores used to be a triumph, particularly with the Elder Scrolls theme, but he's fallen into the background in the wake of allegations of sexual misconduct in 2019. If I can end this musical section on kind of an up note, I had forgotten, like any mid-aughts video game, the end credits needed a pop rock theme that I definitely had in a Zune Pass playlist at one point. Yeah, that's right, I mentioned the superior music player and service. What are you gonna do about it? Well, I guess we're just gonna talk about technology now. Prey was always supposed to be a tech showcase. I mean, yeah, it would have been great if they'd pulled off some of these tricks in the late 90s as they'd planned. But even when I saw it in 2005, I was still like, holy crap, this is amazing. This was despite the fact that Doom 3 and Half-Life 2 had already changed the gaming world in their own huge ways the year before, and Prey was still a year out. Of course, the difference between 1995 Prey and 2005 Prey is that the latter had a lot more technology available to implement their vision. With how the game uses these tricks and sleights of hand, Prey often feels like they kit-bashed the game together, plucking technologies off grocery shelves as they push their cart around. Again, 3D Realms does point out that they had to still create a lot of their own technology for this game. Portals, one of the game's biggest tricks, finally made sense to me after years of being described how they worked in text, when no other game even tried to implement them. I mean, sure, that DigiPen student game Narbacular Drop released in 2005, but most of the world wouldn't even know about it until long after Valve had snapped up that team and put them to work on Portal, which released in 2007. In 2006, Prey's Portals still felt very, very new. If you've played Portal, or you're actually watching this video at this very moment, Portals make sense. But much like those old magazines, trying to write out how they succeed is far more difficult than showing you. I mean, look at this portal framed by a metal loop that sends you to another place. But the portal disappears when you wander to the other side of the loop. And what's in that portal is a whole other space, or it's in the same space, or larger, or smaller, but mostly smaller. Sometimes it's used to create disorienting pocket rooms and spaces for puzzles, but most of the time it's designed to send you to some other random place on this sphere, maybe hundreds of miles away, to a place that's tonally different than the one you were just in. This is an interesting idea, but after a while it kinda just feels like a cheap way to implement level design non sequiturs to get you to some other set piece they had in mind without any logical rationale for doing so. Despite these sleights of hand, portals don't eliminate loading sections. Speaking of which, holy crap, are these load screens loud, disruptive, and ugly. Because this is a video game, the most popular implementation of these portals is to spawn in enemies, sometimes on anti-gravity walkways. In fact, quite often on anti-gravity walkways. The trade-off is that killing an enemy on an anti-gravity walkway or walk pad and watching their corpse fall up and away or towards you is pretty great. Likewise, the little recursive loops the game creates are fun moments as well. I enjoyed this hallway maze a good bit, and they could have probably done it one or two more times before I got irritated. The 90s version of Prey was originally developed with a portal gun, in which you could cast your own entry and exit portals, a mechanic that many of us are pretty familiar with now. But the Prey that shipped didn't have this. Minus some preordained switches to get you between missions or to help you solve puzzles, you have no control over the game's portals at all. As a result, they remain a bit of a parlor trick rather than becoming a legitimate game mechanic. Okay, so I have to inject a little bit of developer-publisher explanation. If you've seen my Max Payne Trilogy review, and of course you have, you already know that Gathering Developers, the publisher with whom 3D Realms and Human Head were working with for Prey, was purchased by 2K. And this all fits because Gathering Developers and 3D Realms had been working with Remedy to produce their Max Payne games, which ultimately became Rockstar Releases, which is a subdivision of 2K. With Prey, Scott Miller says that 2K was pushing them to get the game out by the summer of 2006, and after a lengthy development period, one thing that failed to make the cut was, ta-da, the portal gun. Miller says they could have put one in with about 6 more months of development time, and I believe mechanically they could have done that, but there's nothing in Prey that indicates that there's any way they could have done anything with it. Even though Portal is a more linear game, it has larger environments designed specifically for Portal-based experimentation and puzzles. How useful a portal gun would have been outside of the multiplayer, which I didn't touch for this review, is debatable at best. Another feature that didn't make it out of the original late 90s Prey was destructible environments. Again, like Portals, it was impressive to see in demo, but it's hard to imagine how they would have fit in with what shipped, a game built with enclosed static environments. In the earliest Duke Nukem Forever footage from 1998, you can see a scene where stuff looks destructible in a similar way to what Shutima showed off that same year in Prey, but it's clear that it was a short-lived passion at 3D Realms. You're still blowing stuff up in the Prey that shipped, of course, but the gameplay is so simple that even Red Faction-ish or destructible structures seem like they would have been way out of place here. What Human Head implemented instead was microgravity, and it facilitates nearly all of the game's memorable moments. No longer is up always up, or down always down, and the game's most imaginative moments come when you don't know precisely where you're at, and you get to dabble with the game's ability to disorient you. This also facilitates the majority of the game's puzzles, which we'll come back to. What's interesting is that the idea of walking up walls came from work that Human Head had developed for a Daikatana 2 that never came to be, thankfully. Many times you're finding switches to activate these walkways, or slide around sections of them that allow you to traverse areas. There are also planetoids that you get to bounce along, and that's fun. But for all their theatricality, they lend to some awkward transitions as you move between discrete zones of gravity. I understand why they implemented it this way, but it makes the more open-ended sections feel wonky. When you're up in the air in the game's many flying sections, you obviously don't notice it as much. That's right, we've got some hella Descent-ish sick stuff fun going on here with a ton of Matrix-ish, Sentinel-ish robots to shoot out of the sky. Well, the sky being a relative term. This won't be the last Matrix-esque illusion that the game slips in either. These sequences definitely feel like they're of that era, back when hopping in a vehicle was a natural segue to some other section of the level. But unlike Descent, you can't flip your ship over upside down. This prevents you from being completely disoriented in normal operation, but ironically, it becomes a little disorienting during segments where you need to traverse vertically. The space pods you use to get around aren't just fragile, they have finite ammo as well, meaning you can't just dawdle in space or do too much combat, or you'll explode and die and have to do the whole segment over to that point. Sometimes the game awkwardly implements these sections to move you very short physical distances because you don't have a big jump or teleport mechanic. Your pod also has a tractor beam to move stuff around for the couple times you need to do that, and the game reminds you that this exists every time the pod forms around you. It creates the illusion that you're going to use it more often than you do, and the potential filled my imagination. Like, maybe you could use it as a way to fling enemies into walls as a secondary weapon, but the game seems completely unambitious about this mechanic. This is a thought we'll come back to. My favorite flank section, however, is coming to a complex spinning reactor that reminded me a whole lot of the climax of Return of the Jedi, when they're zooming through the second Death Star to the reactor hanging alone in a giant chamber. You have to destroy all these orbiting plates before you can knock out the center reactor column proper. The original Star Fox had sections like this as well, and they were some of my favorites there too. One last fun little thing the game does is kind of an extension of what id Tech 4 allowed for, and that's the display stuff. A lot of the displays in this game, and the game has some pretty convenient TV-ish displays everywhere for you to interact with, feature some low-resolution, primitive animations, and those are interesting, but some do more. Like, right off the bat in Jen's bar, you get to play with slot machines or Pac-Man clones, and those are fun little distractions. These displays were essential in Doom 3 to open doors and administer health and whatever, but here they serve as an excellent way to gain imaginary digital coins. You might say that Prey invented Bitcoin mining. Yeah? It seems strange to admit that it would have been fun for Prey to include a pipe dreamish puzzle game to unlock doors, kind of like BioShock did. It would have been something, an extra layer, another mechanic, something interesting to make these displays more worthwhile. Anyway.
Hello there yet again. Meow, it's been a while, hasn't it? I'm Kirby, the official mascot of the Nth Review, and I hope you're enjoying this Prey review. I really do. I've been watching Dad work on it, and he's been really excited for you guys to watch it. It gets really interesting here in a minute, trust me. Hey look, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but me butting in on the last review really seemed to help, so I'm sure Dad won't mind that I snuck in here again to talk about the Nth Review Patreon. There are so many cool games and series and projects that you've told him you're interested in seeing reviewed, and I know he really wants to get to them. He reads every single comment you guys post, and he really wants to be able to do more Nth reviews on games that matter to you. But he's got to work somewhere else to pay the bills and feed me. And then I guess have enough money to feed himself, I guess. He's been thinking about doing the Mass Effect trilogy, or the long, agonizing death of Silicon Knights across 3 iterations of console hardware. What about all of David Cage's games at Quantic Dream? He would absolutely love to tackle them all and so much more with your support. Please, if you want to see more reviews, and you want to see bigger reviews, and you want to see them quickly, you should really check out patreon.com/the Nth Review. There, you can support the channel so he can do work like that. For just $1 a month, you can support the channel and get access to the monthly Q&A. For $5 a month, you'll get your name listed in the credits at the end of the show, and you can even contribute to these reviews like you'll see later in this video. Help my dad out and check out patreon.com/the Nth Review. What's that address again? Why, it's patreon.com/the Nth Review. Meow reviews, meow often, meow bigger, meow stuff. Go check it out. Meow, 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 meow.
Where am I?
This is the land of your fathers, Tommy. The land of the ancients.
The land of all that Cherokee crap, it's a bunch of superstitious bullshit. I don't believe this.
Your beliefs will soon change.
I'm glad I'm older and I guess wiser reviewing this game now versus when I played it last or when it came out, because I don't think I would have given the game's themes of faith and religion the proper amount of justice and inspection they deserve. To establish some context, both personally and historically, I want to introduce this section in a few parts. There's a meme that goes around in progressive circles featuring a map of North America's indigenous tribes. It pokes at the notion that because of racial whitewashing, kids these days aren't going to be familiar with where the First Nations lived, or that they even existed before the Europeans came over at all. Well, I grew up in Nebraska. It's not an exciting place by any means, but in the mid-90s, Nebraska's 4th grade curriculum required kids to learn about the state's history. And it's not an exciting history either. I mean, we learned to square dance, but ultimately Nebraska is a place where the homesteaders came and settled, and wagons passed through on their way to the coast as we fulfilled our nationalistic dream of manifest destiny. The thing is, our textbooks had maps like this, and I'm pretty familiar with them. 4th grade is the point where Nebraska felt we needed to learn about what the Americans did to the natives. We read textbooks, we watched clips from Dances with Wolves, we watched early episodes of Little House on the Prairie, we witnessed live native dances and learned the names of the tribes that lived in different parts of the state. We learned about their resourcefulness, how they lived responsibly and simply, using every part of every creature, treating them as blessings and gifts. We were then taught that white men came and killed countless buffalo with their advanced weaponry, allowing their bodies to rot in the sun out of spite, going to waste, and sabotaging the livelihoods of the tribes who relied on those buffalo to survive. At the same time, we sympathize with the settlers of this strange new empty land who had to then cooperate with the population that they were displacing. We had to process these things at once, unironically. Nebraska hadn't whitewashed the existence of the natives away, but they had kept the most important R-rated parts out. There's no point in answering what happened to the natives we displaced if you don't raise the questions. We quietly understood that some things were better left unsaid to young, impressionable ears. I live in Colorado Springs, at the base of one of America's most popular mountains. I see it every single day alongside an entire horizon of other mountains. I love it. There is no mountain or elevation taller in the United States east of here. We're called the Front Range for a reason. Centuries ago, the Ute tribes that settled here called the mountain Tavakav, or Tava, which means Sun Mountain. Tava is the first peak to greet Grandfather Sun each morning as it rises. These natives believed that they were created on Tava, and they summited it several times a year to pay tribute to their creator. In 1806, President Jefferson commissioned the Army to explore the extremities of the new Louisiana Purchase. The Pike expedition, led by Lieutenant Zebulon Montgomery Pike, reached the base of Tava by late November. Pike was in awe of the mountain, which was visible from many miles away along their westward route, and as hard as they tried, they could not summit it during their winter spur. They returned south, exploring the Colorado High Country via the Arkansas River. As the American settlers came, they inevitably summited Tava, giving it new generic names like Grand Peak, Great Peak, and then Pike's Highest Peak, despite the fact that Pike never reached the top. When they found gold here in 1858, the local media shortened it to Pike's Peak with the apostrophe, and the subsequent gold rush, enabled by new railroad lines, allowed for the creation of Colorado Springs, the place I call home. But we never called the mountain Tava. In 1890, the United States Board on Geographic Names removed the apostrophe, and for all intents and purposes, the mountain was officially called Pikes Peak. 3 years later, Catherine Lee Bates summited the mountain and, inspired by its incredible views, would write the poem America the Beautiful. I grew up in a conservative Christian home and asked to be baptized on my 10th birthday, which was on a Sunday. I didn't really feel more Christian or obedient as a result because I'd already grown up in the faith, but it was a powerful ceremony for me as a kid. Over the years, the doubts crept in, which the church told me I'd have. But as a teenager, the stronger and stronger demands to suspend my disbelief made things difficult to square. As someone who's familiar with reality and what happens in it, it was hard to watch a movie like The Animated Prince of Egypt and swallow the notion that events like that, or anything approaching that, had actually happened. It felt strange that I would pray for something material in the world, and understanding whether it did or didn't happen because of that prayer required ever-increasing feats in mental gymnastics. Not long after I turned 25, I put my faith to the test with a thought experiment. What if I set aside my loyalty to Christianity to explore its validity on evidence alone? And bear in mind, this was very scary for me because I knew that if I ultimately sided against my faith, I risked eternal damnation in the afterlife. Very quickly, though, I realized that my Christian faith required me to cling to it for dear life to make it real for me. Once I loosened my grip and let go, the world made a lot more sense. Some things took longer for me to realize than others. Initially, I took to deism, the faith of many of America's founding fathers, and a parallel to the faith of Vicar Max from The Outer Worlds. It took years to understand and agree with the concept of biological evolution over millions of years, that we truly are trillionth cousins with every living thing on Earth. It took me a long time to understand the plight of the LGBT community that my faith had spent so much effort to discriminate against and suppress, as though they shunned good old-fashioned Christian lifestyles out of spite. It took me longer to understand the ongoing systematic oppression of minorities in this country I loved so much. Eventually, I began to understand the gravity of the large-scale genocide we had committed against the tribes here under the banner of patriotism. As kids, we were taught that these lands were discovered by the European settlers, rather than being invaded, exploited, and destroyed by Europeans. I understood the world very wrong for a very long time.
Hey, Tommy!
What are you looking at? Real tough guy. Can't even tell her you love her. I gotta get off this damn reservation. If she'd just come with me, it'd all be different. It'd all be... Listen to yourself. Who do you think you're kidding?
Tommy, get your ass out here.
Prey opens in Jen's bar on an Oklahoman Cherokee reservation. Oklahoma was another slice of land that the Americans had originally given to the natives entirely before walking it back, hundreds of square miles at a time like they did so often. Tommy is tired of this life. He served in the U.S. Army as a mechanic and had seen the world far beyond this reservation, becoming drunk on the possibilities of life outside it. And yet here we are, in his girlfriend's dark, barely stocked, run-down bar whose only patrons are a pair of burly drunk white guys who make racist comments and hit on her. I felt Tommy's resentment with the fact that the people he loves cling to what little the white man left them with, while he embraces what the world outside could deliver. He wants to take Jen and run. The game's tagline was, Earth's hero doesn't want the job, and on the surface you could see how this paints Tommy as a bit of a selfish dick. He's actually kind of insufferable for the game's first few hours. It actually felt irritating when I played this in 2012, but playing it today, it feels far more justified. Tommy's transition back to Damacy through Prey feels like my own religious journey in reverse, because the game makes the Cherokee faith real. Where I sought evidence and found none, my faith vanished. Where Tommy sought evidence that his knowledge and weaponry were useless against an alien foe, his faith grew.
Okay, I've passed your little test. Send me back.
First, you must master the bow. You must learn to fight.
Not a problem. The army taught me to kill, remember?
You fought in white man's wars, with white man's weapons. Now it is time to fight with your own.
Where I lost faith in the power of prayer to affect the world or serve as anything more than a placebo, Tommy can call out to his deceased grandfather and be instantly transported to the spirit realm and be provided practical skills and tools. The aliens that abduct you are actually the dark ones of Cherokee mythology, so the Cherokee had the correct religion, and their faith, or even Tommy's lack of faith, grants him all of the supernatural powers needed to defeat them. With the help of your once pet bird Talon, now a spirit guide, you can even read their foreign glyphs on alien displays. Wraiths appear from the spirit world to possess children and cause havoc in one of the few moments in any game where you get to murder children, although the game is very clear that they're ghost children and not real children. But Tommy is in such disbelief of what is happening around him that even as he stands in the land of the ancients with the grandfather he just saw ground to a pulp in an alien digestive machine, he still can't admit it's real. He eventually grows into this role because his connection to his religion allows him to perform extraordinary acts. In both the late 90s Prey and the shipping Prey, 3D Realms took particular care to implement Cherokee mythology. I just mentioned the land of the ancients where your grandfather resides in death. It's a beautiful place inspired by bright western American deserts, and it serves equal parts tutorial and a bucket of cold water on Tommy's spiritual hesitance. It's also a visual relief after pushing through miles of dark and squishy Doom-like levels. Prey's story and framework is a more convincing case for religion than any Christian media I ever experienced growing up. Eat shit left behind. Both Tommy and Jen are voiced by Plains Cree from Canada, Michael Greyeyes and Crystal Lightning respectively, and in interviews, Michael explained that he would work with the writers at 3D Realms to make the story and dialogue more authentic. Tommy's grandfather and spiritual guide Anisi is voiced by John Williams Galt, who viewers of this channel might also recognize as the voice of Joseph Manderley, and Jock, and Tracer Tong from Deus Ex. Okay, that seems pretty problematic racially. What struck me as odd about the story, I suppose, is that in the end you take over as the boss of the sphere and fly it into the sun to destroy it, killing yourself in the process. But when you meet Jen and Anisi in the land of the ancients afterward, they don't get to come back to the mortal coil after being killed on the sphere. It's not your time, Anisi says, sending you back to be a prolific intergalactic badass, while they get to enjoy the Cherokee afterlife. On its face, it seems like a cheap way to make the Macho Man protagonist look that much more macho. But as you play the game, it becomes clear that you have special abilities to frighten and to destroy your enemies, but mostly to destroy them, and not frighten them at all. The first major tool you have at your disposal is your ability to split in half spiritually via spirit walking. Now here in the real world, especially in this economy of side jobs and hustle grinds and YouTube channels, we dream of having multiple versions of ourselves to accomplish our goals. But if we had a twin, what would they do? Would we have them edit a video while you played a game? Would you have them write a script while you recovered from an upload blitz? No, Prey explains, you would have your twin work with you to flip 2 switches at the same time to bring down an elevator in that way that video games work. Or, if they had the ability to walk through special force fields, you'd have them walk through special force field to turn those special force fields off so you could take your corporeal form and come right through. And while you're spirit walking, which you enter with a simple button press, your corporeal Demacy just hangs there in space, vulnerable, preventing you from operating both at the same time. By the way, I'm just going to use Tommy and Demacy interchangeably depending on what part of the spiritual journey he's in. Principally, as you might already understand, your spirit form is used to solve puzzles, to unlock areas you can't get to toggle things you can't do alone. Your spirit form can see and cross spirit bridges to do all of that other stuff I just said, which can't be seen or accessed in the corporeal realm. Your spirit form also has a bow and arrow to cut down dudes, but combat in spirit form is woefully underutilized, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But death is not the end in Prey, for better and worse. Rather than sending you back to a loading screen or a checkpoint or having you reload a save when you die, which you will do, you enter death walking. Here, Tommy's body slowly reels back from the spirit world while you bounce around an arena shooting different colored wraiths to restore your health and replenish your spirit bow ammo, like you'll ever need it. It escapes the purely punitive respawn animation of 2 humans' lengthy Valkyrie summon when you die there, because, well, it's not as long, but it also gives you the opportunity to recover health so you don't die immediately after respawning. That said, I labored for the longest time that you needed to kill wraiths to return to the game, but you don't. You can just stand there waiting and then jump in. You can also do the opposite by clinging to the edge of the arena and snipe as many wraiths as possible before the well sucks you back in. And then you're right back where you died. The higher Cherokee difficulty removes health pickups from the game, but retains the Deathwalk mechanic, so even then, dying is only a momentary inconvenience. And for the record, I did not play it on that difficulty. So what about the rest of the game? Alongside the game's religious themes, Prey provides a lot of non-spiritual help as well. As someone who isn't very good at playing video games, I made it through this game relatively easily. Playing it on the higher difficulty wouldn't have been a challenge, it would have just been annoying. The game provides a lot of health all the time in the form of these wall creatures, or pickups, and the levels are designed in a way that, aside from some navigational snafus, they're actually really linear. If you have any doubt that you're supposed to pop into spirit form to solve a puzzle, you'll find a clearly visible emblem burned into the level just in case. We'll talk about those in the puzzles later, but Prey's combat felt strange and outdated even when it came out, amongst its myriad of other ideas. Over the course of the game, you'll gather half a dozen weapons, which essentially become a full dozen through alt-fire modes in that weird way that 90s shooters did. And they're fun guns to shoot. Ammo is easy to manage, you just sponge it up from the environment. There's never a need to strategize what guns to use at different times, you just squeeze off whatever you have on hand. This did lead to a couple of awkward moments when I ran out of ammo for everything, so I was back to my basic rifle just waiting for it to recharge its first 3 shots, which you get for free before finding more charges for it in the environment. There were definitely firm moments of sitting and waiting. Your most interesting weapon is probably the leech rifle, or whatever it's actually called. Basically, you leech ammo from pods around the sphere, which usually present in pairs and allow you to dole out elemental damage. This damage is largely aesthetic. You'll have the fire ammo next to the ice ammo, but it's not like enemies are more or less susceptible to fire or ice damage. It's not like freezing an enemy is any more satisfying than torching them. I mean, I guess I can understand if you think it is, but the more interesting ammo you can leech for this gun obviously comes later on when you get the lightning insta-kill juice or the death rays. Those are rad. There are weapons that do get left behind, which feels bad considering you don't have a lot of them to begin with. The alien crab things that serve as grenades are a really interesting concept, but there's something about how spacious the environments are, how rarely enemies cluster, and how long they take to go off that really limits their effectiveness. Most disappointing of all for how extremely ineffective and rarely used it is your melee. You can't tap a dedicated button to melee someone when you're in range. You have to intentionally select the separate wrench and then use it in close quarters. Oh, how I would have enjoyed smacking a balloon dog or whacking one of the people aliens. But there was no point in ever using the melee when ammo for everything else was typically plentiful. But then, even with some fun weapons in your arsenal, combat isn't usually very interesting. It's honestly more noteworthy for how weird it feels, like original Deus Ex weird at times. Go watch that review, by the way. First off, using your triggers, yes, I played with a controller, to both fire your guns and activate switches, sucks. What a stupid decision. How many times have I fired at a keypad instead of just placing my stolen alien hand on it? Lots. But I have to emphasize the feels aspect of the combat. Doom 3 made a big deal about its body-specific damage, and bodies that vaporized into hellish dust. If you shot a very specific section of an arm, that's where the damage would display, rather than broadly and simply altering the state of that body part. This was a big deal when you were in that game's cramped environments tackling slow-moving zombie-ish enemies. But here in Prey, it feels like they've stripped all that out and replaced it with less. It really feels regressive. The enemies here don't react well to your weaponry. In fact, this is part of a larger issue I have with the enemies' designs, but more specifically their animations. All of these creatures and foes feature this weird, twitchy, herky-jerky movement. It looks unnatural and not in a good, this is a very strange place way. Where Doom 3 made you feel like you were shooting demons, Prey's combat feels like it's barely out of the engine tests that make sure it functions at all. When you dispatch an enemy, their body collapses or flies away with loose, low-weight ragdolling that you'd expect from that era, and honestly, probably earlier. Combat doesn't look quite right, and it doesn't feel quite right. And then there's the mechanics of it all. Weapons you think would kill enemies don't kill enemies, like the bio-shotgun, or when you're flying around in your shuttle. Several of these weapons feel underpowered, and pummeling foes with far too many rounds feels weird too. That bio-shotgun, which is the name I gave it, really feels like it needs some kind of damage over time effect, like an audible hiss and a visual steam on affected surfaces to really sell it. I don't have any proof of it, but it would be neat if it did actual dot damage, because it doesn't seem like it does. It also seems to do more or less damage depending on the organic content of the enemy you're killing it with, which I also can't verify. What I'm trying to say is that I really liked it, and I wish it didn't feel like an elaborate alien paintball gun. But then I have to dip back into the spirit walking mechanics. You can use your spiritual bow and arrow as an extra weapon on your keyring to take out enemies. Obviously this is limited because your body is stationary and extremely vulnerable while you use it. You also can't access big chunks of level while spirit walking, which limits the weapon's usefulness. Primarily, you use it as a weapon to eliminate enemies while resolving puzzles that you can only resolve in spirit mode, so you have less of a mess to deal with as you flip switches and revert back to your body. You have a limited supply of ammo, perhaps to avoid just running around the level as an invincible spiritual entity slashing down aliens. Like so many of this game's ideas, the lack of spirit combat feels like a missed opportunity. The AI is very simple. It uses cover, but it doesn't seem to have much in the way of spatial awareness or strategy, so they're rarely more than cardboard pop-ups that you need to take out. It compensates for this through, of course, trickery. The enemy's best trick seems to be the fact that they're spawned on top of you via portals, or they're on surfaces that you're not oriented to, or you're up in the air flying and they're taking advantage of 3D space. Of course, all of these issues are exacerbated by the game's handful of boss battles and fights against tougher enemies, or an endgame tempest against all of the game's bosses in a series. It seems strange to me that even though Prey banks on its technical elements, the combat feels so off. This is a game produced by 3D Realms, the guys who made Duke Nukem 3D, based on an engine created by id, the creators of Doom. And yet the actual part of the game where you click on enemies to death feels so strange. It's amazing that with all the balls that 3D Realms and Human Head were juggling to make this game an act, that seemed to fall away. Oh well, I suppose it's not like we'll get a sequel or anything. So now we need to explore the through line of Prey and how the game tells its story.
Oh my God.
Prey is a simple game, so when it hits its stride, it's not when you're shooting aliens, but when you're in the throes of the game's numerous set pieces, manipulations of gravity, and cinematic sequences. The game has an amazing introduction and an amazing conclusion, but the middle? We'll get to that. But that intro? My goodness, that intro. It was easy to sell the game when the free downloadable demo included this opening abduction sequence. The game invests a lot of effort in establishing the kind of filthy shithole you start in. Condom dispensers hang on the wall, which is plastered with posters for local band concerts. Tommy makes pithy remarks about how Jen has let the bar go to shit, and surveying the back of the house experience, it's clear that things are not exactly brimming with, anything. This bar appears to exist by the sole virtue of being the lone port of liquid satisfaction for miles. It's grimy and low rent, desperate and low class, like so many places I've stopped at during road trips throughout the American Southwest. The mirrors in this bar's women's restroom are vandalized so much that they're not even there. Hope you didn't need to fix your eyeliner or something. In the bar you'll run into minimal tutorialization except to cave in some heads in one of the few moments you'll probably ever use your melee weapon. And then, of course, comes the vivid abduction scene. As Patreon assistant producer James Baldy Wyatt puts it, you get kidnapped by aliens while Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper plays. Rock. Of course. The rumble, the glow of objects disappearing into the alien apparatus floating above the bar. It's all so incredibly produced, and no matter how hard you try, you get sucked into its foreign rays just as easily as you get sucked into reality during your death walks later on. The first hour of Prey may be one of the best first hours, providing the best first impressions in any game. Fading into the interstellar alien sphere ship, the game goes a mile a minute, demonstrating the strangeness of this place, along with all of its mechanics. Most of Prey is very linear, a hallway to a set piece, to a hallway to a puzzle, to a hallway to a boss, and so forth. The core gameplay, essentially, is to figure out how to toggle a switch. Yes, most of this game is flipping a nondescript switch to set up another series of hallways and set pieces to flip another nondescript switch. It can be a regular switch, an obscured combination switch, it can be a gravity flipping switch, but it is a switch nonetheless. Of course, there will be plenty of moments when you flip a switch and you're not entirely sure what it did, which both frustrates the game's pace and builds on the game's enigmatic setting. As a result, everything between that first incredible hour and its cinematic conclusion is a bit of a slog. Of course, it's a relief that, aided by its generous respawn mechanic, the game isn't very long. But shooting your way between switches wouldn't be very memorable or interesting, as forgettable and uninteresting as chunks of this game are, if it weren't for the puzzles the game implements to slow you down. Transitioning from blowing up flushing aliens in a corridor to the game grinding to a halt while you figure out how to do something really makes the game's puzzles feel like a stilted way to extend the how long to beat time. Prey requires you to use microgravity, portals, and spirit walking, or some combination of those things, to navigate spaces and, ultimately, flip a switch. Sometimes these puzzles are your whip standard, you don't have the combination for this combination lock, but it is conveniently nearby in the environmental dressing and you don't need any extra game mechanics to figure it out sorta deals. But others are pretty obtuse. There was one puzzle that I got so stuck on, wandering the puzzle space back and forth, up and down, that I had to stop for a bit and consult a guide. And when I read this ancient, highly rated GameFAQs guide, I realized something extremely stupid. It was the exact same puzzle that I got stuck on when I played the game a decade ago, and also needed to pull up a guide. Probably this exact same one. Going into this review, I remembered this game-halting puzzle. I even remembered the solution, knowing I'd run into it. But I'd forgotten all of the other details. So here I was, stuck hard on the exact same puzzle twice. Good, trap there, human head. So for your reference, when you see this chasm, back up a few steps and look up to find a gravity switch that will flip the entire world upside down so you can advance. The game to this point has inspired you to look on walls and ceilings that could easily become floors, and I don't know where the game instructs you to look up, straight up, to find and solve puzzles, but hoo boy did the game get me good here. Again. And nothing else in this puzzle space will help you to find the solution. The translated alien text doesn't help. The spirit bridge doesn't help. The one live gravity switch here doesn't do anything because you're already oriented the way that it relatively is. It'll make more sense when you play it. Of course, Talon, your helper, lands on what looks like another gravity switch that'll help you, but it's locked in a harness and can't be freed no matter how much ammo you dump into it. Cool. Oh, and Talon isn't much of a help for most of the game's puzzles, even if providing some light guidance is mechanically what he should be doing besides the moments where he gets angry and chomps on enemies. Most of the time he's flying around the level nonsensically, clipping through walls. He teases you about solutions when you're stuck and then doesn't provide a lot of relief when you really need it. He'll stoically perch on broken switches that aren't part of any solution. When Talon was genuinely helpful, that puzzle was pretty straightforward to begin with. But then a lot of the game relies on being somewhat murky and difficult to parse. The game probably has the most fun with being a genuinely alien environment among alien shooter games, because it challenges you to investigate the levels to solve them on your own. Except, for that one thing. That said, the magic fades at the inevitable point where you've been overexposed to the game's id-like spaces tied together with fleshy tunnels. The scenery genuinely doesn't change all that much. Hell, I can edit in footage of this game in practically any random order I want, and I doubt you'd be able to discern at what point of the game I was in. But some of the most puzzling aspects of this game don't seem intentional. Unlike an onion, Prey doesn't have a lot of layers. Even the spirit walking aspect I talked about earlier, the game's biggest additional gameplay mechanic, feels less than useful outside of the sections it was specifically designed for. When it comes to puzzling the player, Prey is very interested in gimmicky, one-off mechanics. They're introduced and dispensed with so quickly that when the game prods you to use them again, you've probably forgotten about them. Here are a few examples. At a point, you encounter keypads that require an alien's hand to unlock. You flip switches all the time in this game, but these specific ones feature you pressing an alien hand against the interface rather than your own. Cosmetically it's different, but mechanically it's identical. You don't get to enter any special areas with this alien hand, or unlock anything, or uncover anything special with it. You don't even select the alien hand when you need to use it. The only differentiation is that the game displays you using an alien hand at these arbitrary points to move you along the golden path. This would be a bit of a wash as a feature really, just interesting set dressing, except that these alien keypads blend into the environment easier than the TV pods on stocks that the other switches tend to be. This meant that there were a couple points where I was stuck scouring levels until I realized there was an alien keypad that functions identically to the regular one that I needed to find before I could advance. And then there are the fleshy soccer balls that you shoot to explode and destroy environmental gates. The game respawns these to ensure you don't get stuck. You may remember that your flying shuttle pod thing has a tractor beam, but probably not. You can also activate and deactivate alarm switches for some reason. I had to replay the last third of this game due to a recording error. The error being that I forgot to hit the record button. And knowing the solutions to the game's puzzles makes this breezy game even breezier, cutting playtime by almost half. Considering how linear these levels are and how little the gameplay varies, Prey doesn't encourage replays except probably for speedrunning purposes. This is the point where I can tell you that I know that the fastest Prey speedrun is just over an hour and a half. Of course, you might need to replay it to capture footage for, some reason. I've already talked plenty about the portals. The game has them, and just as you're getting used to a space, the game whisks you to some other random location, preventing you from gaining any sense of scale or orientation about where you're at in this massive ship. On top of the typical level design, portals feel like a cheap way to keep you moving, like a splash of glitter at arbitrary moments. And I mean, I love glitter and shiny things as much as the next guy, but portals provide no actual gameplay outside of a couple puzzles. But then, where is the here that you're at anyway? Thanks to some helpful infographics and navigation stations littered throughout the game, you do get a very loose frame of reference about where you've been abducted to. This sphere is an organic mechanical interstellar spaceship that's pretty darn big. It's this webby patchwork of a ball, and very interesting to think about conceptually. Its inhabitants are a Borg-like covenant of aliens who, however long ago, sowed life across the galaxy with the ultimate goal of returning millennia later to harvest that growth for its life-sustaining protein. It's a really familiar trope in science fiction, and it wasn't long into this playthrough that I realized how silly this idea was. You wonder how in the galaxy these tiny little slivers of human jerky provide enough power to energize just the massive heavy machines that grind them up, much less power in an interstellar organic spaceship. Logical issues aside, Prey establishes very well the horror of this terrible place with its pervasive screaming and suffering as you wander through its digestive sections. The sphere didn't just abduct people, but objects and places as well. It's fun to see parts of the bar ingested and integrated into the scenery in new ways. Or here's an airplane being teleported mid-flight attempting to navigate tight alien canyons, Maverick style. I have to admit that the resulting crash site looks a bit more cohesive than it should be, but we can talk about the realism of extraterrestrial spaces in another video. The sphere also regularly reminds you that it is a living, breathing, organic creature. This seems to fade as you get into the more metaphysically abstract mechanical sections later on, but its walls undulate and move. There's a real sense of physical or symbiotic connection between the ship and its inhabitants. The walls puke on you randomly, and it would be negligent of me not to mention the puertas that the spider centaurs use to move in and around levels. The sphere is also a mechanical, manufactured, and designed place. I mean, yes, there's a lot of glossy looking mechanical stuff and apparati hemming and hawing all over, but one of my favorite sections involves the game assembling chunks of level around you like Lego bricks coming together. The game thankfully bites its tongue when it comes to this trick. The sphere has vents to crawl through, but this is far from an immersive sim. I guess we'll have to play Prey for that. One thing that did catch my eye during flying segments were the skyscraper-esque details along external surfaces. It seriously looks like huge chunks of this sphere are designed to look like floor-by-floor offices or residences, even though there's nothing you experience in this game that resembles anything like that. The master of this monster is Mother. If these are the Borg, if this is their Borg sphere, then Mother is their Borg queen. Coming off the System Shock games, the parallels to that series' matron antagonist were undeniable. She's omnipotent and speaks to you through a blurry veil, which is a really cool effect. It becomes apparent to her quickly that you're a pest slashing their way through her operations. But this isn't Shodan by any means, and we'll come back to this in a second. Before you even understand that Mother is around watching you, you encounter the Resistance, a group of humans who are actively sabotaging her operations. They help you out of sticky situations before darting back into the darkness. Eventually the veil falls and they bring you into their lair where their leader, Eloise, explains that they're building a portal to get back to Earth. I'm not sure how useful this would be, considering the sphere would still have all the power to abduct you right back on its own terms yet again, but okay. Their operations and goals are enigmatic enough that they avoid looking arbitrary for the sake of game progression. They don't seem to have guns or much force on their side, so their weapons are incisive operations that they can only pull off with their personalized portals. They are essentially playing Prey and flipping switches, but their version of the game doesn't have guns. There's not much to this conflict because there isn't much to this story. It's not just that the gameplay is simple and sometimes rote, it's that the game doesn't provide much narrative propulsion either. Jen serves as the game's damsel in distress, and each time you reach a metaphorical castle, the princess isn't there. Like seriously, she may as well be hauled away by Bowser in one of his propeller cups. Mother uses Jen as bait to kite you from squishy hallway to giant machine to flying section. When you finally catch up to Jen, you realize that she's been bolted at the waist to an alien machine gun monster boss. Killing the boss puts you into the position where you need to kill your girlfriend to end her misery. Mother wants this moment to break you and offer the sphere and all of its powers to you in a Faustian deal. Unlimited life and power and all the armies you could ever want to crush anyone or anything who would dare oppose you on an interstellar spacecraft of seemingly unlimited capability. But why? Shodan was a complex villain who spun a lot of plates and delivered a lot of evidence for her mission, even if it ultimately seemed like little more than delusional spite. Here, Mother's mission, which is all delivered in the last hour of the game, seems strange. Why does she need to be replaced? Why does she want to be replaced? She seems to be operating of sound mind and body, as best as that comes across. So why does this transaction need to happen where you replace her? Mother's mission is to consume worlds, and one of the game's coolest late game ideas is her invasion of the Cherokee land of the ancients for all its spiritual and tangible spoils. But her mission doesn't seem practical or utilitarian. It seems purely vengeful and malicious. This sphere and its inhabitants and its leader are purely evil. Why? For the sake of making this a horror game? For the sake of making Mother a horror villain? Wouldn't it make sense if Mother spent the game and her energies expressing the earnest need for their civilization to survive, and then personally empathize with Damacy? Or on the flip side, wouldn't it make sense to give him a reason to empathize with her and this violent civilization of interstellar locusts? Shodan's motives seem largely justified because he's untethered from reality, but how do Mother's motives make sense? As an adult, it's not hard to understand why the history we were taught of the settlers and the natives was so sanitized when we were kids. In 1851, the US government struck a deal with the tribes of the Front Range to create and respect a territory of land for them, a reservation. Like an unstoppable force meeting an unmovable object, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was the compromise reached between the westward-driven white Americans and the natives who had settled and lived here for thousands of years. The resulting reservation was drawn across what's now 4 US states. As news of the Front Range gold rush grew in the late 1850s and early 1860s, Congress was forced to carve out a new Colorado territory as American settlers arrived en masse for their chance to strike it rich. But the new settlers' demands of the plains put pressure on the natives, who responded with sporadic raids and violence to preserve their sovereignty. As tensions grew, U.S. government officials faced a growing need to renegotiate their treaty with the tribes to accommodate their own settlers. In 1861, the United States and several Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs signed the Treaty of Fort Wise, which reduced the agreed territory dramatically to the eastern plains of the new Colorado Territory, in exchange for the safe passage of Americans to the west coast. Among those who signed it was Cheyenne chief Black Kettle, a peacemaker who didn't agree with his fellows' raids on the American settlers. Understandably, only a portion of the tribes agreed with Colorado's new territorial governor, John Evans, or Black Kettle. So not only did they not respect the new treaty, they also didn't move into the new reservation. As a result, Governor Evans created a volunteer military regiment to specifically enforce the treaty under the command of Colonel John Chivington. Chivington, a former Methodist minister who had enlisted in the Civil War and quickly rose up in the ranks, was encouraged by Evans to destroy non-compliant natives, who were dubbed hostile. For those who did migrate to the new reservation, conditions were terrible. The land was unusable and disease spread. Continuing negotiations between Evans and the tribes, including Black Kettle, forced natives to submit themselves to American frontier ports or be considered hostile. On the remote southeastern plain of Colorado, Black Kettle and his group of roughly 163 reached the former Fort Wise, now Fort Lyon, for security and sustenance through the winter. But soon after arriving, they were instructed by the fort's inexperienced commanding officer to re-encamp 40 miles away and hunt along the Big Sand Creek within the bounds of the reservation, where they would be joined by other tribes. Black Kettle was told specifically to fly the US flag along with a white flag to indicate their peaceful intentions, and to not be attacked by US troops. Colonel Shivington and his regiment arrived at Fort Lyon in November 1864, hungry for a victory against the indigenous raids. With hundreds of well-armed troops and artillery, they traveled secretly at night to Black Kettle's encampment, while many of the camp's men were out hunting, and opened fire. The numbers vary, but it's believed that at least 150 natives, many of whom were women, children, and elderly, were murdered in a vastly one-sided attack. The Sand Creek encampment was burned, the victims' bodies were mutilated, and their scalps brought to Denver in celebration. The massacre was initially hailed as a victorious battle by territorial troops against belligerent hostiles who wouldn't comply with the governor's orders. But the true motives would become clear. This was just another racist purging of the tribes, an event that would be repeated many times over in America's westward expansion. Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington spent the rest of their lives justifying the massacre by any other means than their known aggressive racism. Not all of the indigenous peoples were bad, the rhetoric went, just the ones who didn't do exactly what they asked for. But several of Shivington's troops spoke out to sympathetic parties, and congressional investigations revealed the true nature of what would become known as the Sand Creek Massacre. By then, Shivington had retired from the military, escaping any real punishment. But Governor Evans had been found complicit in the cover-up and was forced to resign. 30 years later, Colorado's legislation named Denver's most prominent mountain after him, a name that still stands today. As for Black Kettle and his tribe, in continuing to pursue peace, he suffered the same fate as many of his peers. He was relocated over and over to increasingly smaller reservations farther and farther away, moves punctuated by U.S. military firepower, before he and his wife were eventually killed. Today, no reservation exists at all on the eastern plains of Colorado. America's mission was to set the tribes aside by any means possible, as though they were an obstacle to manifest destiny. It was to annihilate them. It's estimated that over 400 years, European powers and the United States government were responsible for the deaths of 12 million indigenous people. As a result, large sections of their history and their stories are lost forever. I've never been to the Sand Creek Massacre site, but my former father-in-law had. And standing there on the flat plains, he said that the sense of death was palpable. Damacy is tempted by promises of unlimited power in exchange for his submission. Mother's already killed his girlfriend, who was his will to live. But over the course of the game, his true mission becomes apparent not just to the player, but to him. He is an agent of his religion, a weapon of his culture, a word of his civilization's phrase. There's nothing good that can come from Damacy's compliance, and his people will be annihilated anyway. His ancestors saw this firsthand when the white men with their American flags stole their land, making promises they wouldn't keep, promising reparations they would never deliver. Anisi doesn't outright say this when he prods you before the opening abduction, but it feels like it. The casual player may be entranced by the theater of slimy aliens with blaster guns sliding out of portals, but there's so much more going on here. Of course, I say all of this right after Mother explains her plans and motivations, and you have to fight her across a 3-stage boss fight that probably feels the most video gamey this video game ever feels like. In the game's closing moments, Damacy takes over the sphere from the defeated Mother on his own terms, and for a fraction of a moment Damacy is tempted by its incredible power, a power that no doubt corrupted Mother's worldview, that would destroy his people. But soon he's aided by Anisi, who breaks him of his trance, and he sends the sphere into the sun, becoming an intergalactic hero summoned to help fight elsewhere by a not-dead Eloise in a post-credits sequence that obviously inspired the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Obviously. Oh, and Eloise isn't dead, even though it looked like she was probably going to. I hadn't mentioned it before because... And then that's it. The ride's over and there's nothing really inviting you back. There are no alternate endings, there are no skill trees to fill out or co-op to revisit. I guess if you were into the multiplayer or you wanted to play it on the higher difficulty, you could get your kicks there, but after a half dozen hours, you could probably just send this thing back to GameStop or Blockbuster and pick up Gears of War in a few months. Prey was a moderate commercial success. It helped to keep the lights on at 3D Realms as they sojourned endlessly on Duke Nukem Forever, but despite the promise that Prey will continue, 2K iced plans for a sequel, placing it right next to the World Crime League. That is, until Bethesda got their hands on it. Through a series of transactions, Bethesda acquired Prey and its IP from 3D Realms in 2009. Miller and Human Head hadn't actually been working on a sequel, but instead brainstormed some ideas that continued directly from the previous game. Under Bethesda, times had indeed changed, and what had worked moderately for Prey just wasn't going to work for a sequel. The result is what it was once an extremely ambitious, extremely promising game that was cut short for reasons that aren't as defined as anyone would probably like. Prey 2 was initially unveiled in a 2010 live-action teaser video. Our new protagonist is probably this inmate here being led down the corridor of a flight by US Marshal. Suddenly, green light blares through the windows and aliens appear, causing some kind of breakup of the plane beneath the sphere from the original game, which floats over Earth. Logically, this means that the game would have had to at least taken place initially during the events of the first game because, the sphere still exists. The second trailer, produced by CGI house Blur, who's done countless other cinematic sequences for video games, released a year later, portraying the new protagonist as a bounty hunter in a parkour-friendly, neon-lit alien metropolis. This was very interesting, but it looked and seemed to play like another game entirely with the Prey name slapped on top, which would, become par for the course. To be completely honest, whatever hype I had for the game after that intensely cinematic 2011 trailer evaporated almost entirely watching the initial reveal of the gameplay. It was clearly very, very early in development, and not just because of the very unpolished UI, which looked appropriately ugly for a Prey game, but in how skin and bones the game looked. The level was compact, the parkour was enticing, but the part about where or why you played the game seemed very light and insubstantial. There was a lot of shooting and covering, which was common for early 2010s actioners, but in an era just before Far Cry 3 and other second-generation immersive sims, the gameplay looked pretty thin. At any rate, despite what I thought, Prey 2 was hype central, with an announced 2012 release date. But then it went very, very dark, and before long the rumor mill spun up that there'd been trouble between Human Head and Bethesda. The game wasn't officially canned until 2014, but Human Head seemed to have been pulled off the project a while before then. Each side seems to have their own narrative about what happened. Bethesda says they were never really satisfied with the quality of Prey 2, and watching that E3 2011 gameplay, I feel that. Human Head employees contend that Bethesda was squeezing them with unrealistic development milestones in hopes that they'd give up their side projects that were keeping the lights on at their studio and agree to be acquired, which they declined. Either way, the game was canned, and Bethesda's Arcane studio, known most famously at that point for their Dishonored immersive sims, were recruited to make their own Prey game, or rather an immersive sim with the Prey name. But that's a story for another review. Human Head would continue to support development on other games before they released Rune 2, a sequel to the game that put them in the limelight to make Prey in the first place. I don't remember Rune 2 at all, and that makes sense because the studio closed shortly after. Lead developer Chris Reinhardt and several former Human Head developers would go on to found Roundhouse Studios, which is run by Bethesda. I don't know how that makes sense, but okay. To date, Roundhouse hasn't unveiled whatever project they're working on, but presumably, it's not a Prey game. Or is it? I actually have no idea. Don't take that seriously.
Greetings.
Prey is a game out of time. Today it feels like a kind of clunky, simple, early Xbox 360 shooter, but back then it felt like an old game given new blood. There are so many elements that felt forward-facing, so many that felt contemporary, and remarkably, so many that felt like they'd been preserved completely undisturbed since the 90s. The way the game presents aliens and abductions feels ripped directly out of that thin slice where the X-Files, XCOM UFO Defense, and Independence Day inflamed our interest in extraterrestrials, Area 51, fantastical government conspiracies, and Men in Black. I mean, does anyone even know who Art Bell is anymore? The gameplay feels old school and simple. The weaponry feels old school. The entire design ethos feels old school. It's hard to imagine a game like this releasing today in much the same way that modern Tetris reissues need some hella extra stuff packed in or mechanics layered on to attract anything more than passing glances. Gamers want more, and the things that Prey tried felt like parlor tricks compared to the more accessible and substantially less dour Portal the following year. I think Patreon producer High Functioning Medium put it pretty succinctly in his note about the game. Prey's hyperlinear levels, impactless shooting, and boring boss fights ultimately fail to capitalize on the promise of its engaging intro and cliffhanger ending, its captivatingly gross id Tech 4-powered art design, its bioorganic weaponry and portal puzzles, and the novelty of its Native American protagonist's culture and magical abilities. Thinking about Prey, I keep coming back to, I wish they would have done more with this, which, is something I think about a lot while reviewing a lot of games. Prey has so many cool ideas, and somehow the game, despite the lengthy development time both before and after its millennial reboot, really only feels like a sampler platter. And I love sampler platters. Seriously, I'll just get one of them as an appetizer and then they become my entree. But here, there's not a lot of meat on these bones. It's linear, it's simple, the game is a thrill ride and then it's over. It's a carnival of quick individual attractions. It slots right into the genre of Call of Duty-esque yank-you-along shooty adventures, where going bigger and more expensive is the only way those games survived when their siblings added talent trees and other immersive sim elements. Or had some really bitchin' multiplayer that changed the industry. Today, Prey seems forgotten for being both too little too late and not enough too early. Every new thing the game accomplished seemed to be immediately eclipsed by other games, and the second game's clear departure from the original reveals how much more Human Head and Bethesda wanted to do. This all brings me back to Prey's greatest victory, its ham-fisted, cheesy, sincere, invisible, dour, and improperly paced tributes to this continent's First Nations. Even if you don't dive deeper into the implications, casting an indigenous man with a crisis of faith as a hero against certain and complete destruction isn't a gimmick, it's history. It's history we've whitewashed and left behind more and more as time marches on, unrelenting. There are regressive demagogues who say that to even bring it up, to even remark about the Europeans' treatment of the natives is some spacey agenda to psychologically manipulate everyday Americans into believing whatever conspiracy theory they've hatched up at that moment. But honestly, in playing this game and seeing Tommy become Damacy, and in seeing him embrace his ancestry and shake off the charms of our modern society, in doing my research for this game and seeing it tie into the creation of the city I love and live in, I really respected Prey's ambition. And this seems to be laid primarily at the feet of 3D Realms, who had the idea to begin with and wrote the story. While Human Head and Bethesda promised that Tommy would return for Prey 2, and I should note that the character was never referred to as Damacy in any of the press coverage I could find, I have doubts that he would have been more than a passing cameo. I get the allure of the alien Blade Runner aesthetic, the quasi-open world shooting gameplay, the Mirror's Edge-esque parkour that Bethesda had previously tried to make popular with Brink, but nothing they ever showed of Prey 2 seemed to have heart back then, and now it seems even less so. It's hard to imagine what the appetite for Prey 2 would have been like if they had tried to extend Cherokee folklore into a sequel, rather than just making a first-person shooting aliens game with RPG-esque dialogue choices. I personally wonder what good would a Prey 2 have been without the heart of the first game beating at its core. The solution, of course, was to make a spiritual sequel to System Shock. Colorado Springs is known famously or infamously as a very red and politically conservative city. Its gold rush days long over and rail lines long removed, it exploded in growth through the mid-20th century by appealing to the federal government as the prime spot for military real estate. To the south, the Army's Fort Carson. To the southeast grew Peterson and Schriever Space Force bases. To the southwest lies Cheyenne Mountain, under which NORAD was tunneled, becoming the setting of countless science fiction properties. And to the north, the Air Force Academy with its iconic ribbed A-frame chapel. By the end of the century, several prominent evangelical Christian organizations had made their homes here. In the wake of other reversions to indigenous names around the country, like Alaska's Denali shedding its Mount McKinley title, talk grew locally about officially reverting Pikes Peak back to Tava. But being a conservative city, the reaction has been fierce. The Pikes Peak America's Mountain branding is too strong. It's too well known. People around this country know this mountain is called Pikes Peak. You can't change it. Why should we change it anyway? Why doesn't the Ute tribe, or what's left of it, speak up more about it? The change is already made, and you can't change it back. And yet, as Matthew Good once sang, when Hollywood runs out of Indians, only the Indians will know. Still, every day I step outside my home, look west to the mountains, and I see Tava on its ancient throne twisted slightly toward the north, and I smile. Well, hello, we've made it to the end of Nth Review number 17 for Prey. I am so happy. I wish I could have gotten out sooner, but you know, when my mental health is better than it's been in a while, like, that's just something that has to go, and that just, it makes sense. I really want to thank you guys, my producers here. This is the first time I've had to shrink the Patreon logo to get more people in. So to my producers, who also get to participate in the monthly Q&A, which I just shot and I'm now uploading, thank you so much for helping the channel out. And if more producers pop up, I mean, hey, maybe I can get reviews out quicker. We'll see. Kirby talked about that. Remember that when he stole the video for a minute? Anyway, that's just how it is. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you've already made it this far and you haven't liked and subscribed, what's going on? What's happening? And join me next time. Next time is going to be Prey 2017. With this current, just the way that I'm able to work right now, it's going to take a while. It honestly might even take longer than Thief did. But again, if this video blows up, if the channel somehow blows up, if I get 1 billion Patreon supporters overnight, then I will absolutely be able to produce it on a shorter time frame. But that's just the way things are now. I'm letting you guys know that, you know, in advance. I'm happy to get this out. I'm happy to share this story with the world. I'm happy to share my opinion, and do this research and be able to tell these stories. And you know, there have been people complaining about, oh my God, you're so progressive, you're social justice warrior. You know, it's about inclusion. It really is. It's about not forgetting, you know, the people who are here, or to leave out people because of their disadvantaged minority and vulnerable states. So, you know, if you have the opinion that more people should be represented all the time and not in this trumped up weird way that progressives like to think of it as, I think everyone wins. Like, literally, where do we, this is not a zero-sum thing where if someone gets more attention or wins more, that you have to lose. It's not, the hill is bigger, okay? There can be multiple kings or queens or whatever on this hill, okay? You have to shed that mindset. I'm so sick of people whining about that. So anyway, stay tuned. Prey 2017 is next. And share alike, and let's get some more Patreon supporters. And hey, I'll see you next time. Pew!